So again, grateful that you are joining us here today. We really believe this space is a special space, and today is a special Sunday. It's special for multiple reasons. One, because we're here in the chapel, but two, because we are really starting our journey through our way of life. If you were not here about a month ago, we started off by talking about how 2024 is going to be a year of bearing fruit, where we looked at John 15 and Jesus invites us to remain in him. And when we remain in him, we will bear much fruit and fruit that lasts. But he reminds us that apart from him, we can do nothing. And so often what we aim and seek to do is that very thing. We seek to do things apart from him, in our own strength, in our own plan, in our own power, and we wonder why we feel empty afterwards. It's because we are not remaining in him. And so we introduce this thing, a tool called a way of life that will help us journey into a life of remaining in Jesus. There's nothing special about this tool other than that it helps us accomplish that end. Because otherwise, remain in Jesus feels a little vague. It kind of leaves you kind of scratching your head, well, how do I do that? Our answer is a way of life will help you accomplish that. And so in our way of life, we have 9 practices that we invite you to participate in daily, weekly, or even monthly. And these practices are not just any practice, they are practices from the very life of Jesus. And as you think about your life, I want to paint a picture here for you this morning. I have up here with me a jar that I have in my office at home, and it is just water and some sand and some rocks from a lake that I went to a couple years ago. But let me paint to you a picture, because I think in many ways this jar is reminiscent of our lives here today. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You wake up and your first thought is, already? I can't wait to go back to bed. The jar gets shaken a little bit. You struggle through your day with low energy, which is borrowed from your stimulant of choice, mine, coffee. We feel an undercurrent of anxiety that rarely ever goes away. We feel like we're always behind, always playing catch up, and never, ever done. Even when we do catch up on our sleep, we still feel exhausted. And as a result, you turn to your escape of choice. You turn to a new show that's streaming online, another glass of wine, or the never-ending scrolling that you find on your social media feed. You live from the surface of your life rather than the deep core of who you are. You react in big ways, and even the smallest thing can be a trigger for you. It doesn't take much for you to lose your temper, bark at your kids, get defensive, feel angry, or maybe even both. All of this happens while we have constant notifications going off, continual access to our email, and a podcast or song always in our ear. And we declare to ourselves, it's just a season. It's just a season. But deep down we know that it's not just a season, that that's a lie, and that this is just going to continue to be the pace of our lives until something changes. And this is what we approach God with, looking much like this water. And we wonder, why can't I see God in the midst of what I'm walking through? Why can't I hear God in what he is leading me into? Why, when I read his word, does my mind just go to all the other tasks and responsibilities that I have? How do we change the pace of our life? Is there a way to break this cycle that we just talked about and experience clarity in what God has invited us into now, and not just now, but also for eternity as well? I believe the answer is not just yes, but absolutely yes. The way to let the mud and sand and muck and much of the stuff of our life settle to the bottom so that the water becomes clear again requires time. The ability for this to happen is not through some magical process. It's through letting this jar sit still, unshaken, And over time, all the stuff that's in the water will fall to the bottom, and you'll be able to see through it again. To settle and let the realities and weights of life fall to the bottom requires time. And I believe that this is exactly what the poet who wrote Psalm 46 is talking about when he instructs you and me with this simple command: be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10 is kind of the cry of this first practice that we will walk through. Be still, and in your stillness, know that He is God. This is a simple invitation that we find in Scripture, yet it feels more distant than ever before in our fast-paced, overstimulated, constantly connected world. And yet it may be the secret to experiencing depth and intimacy in our life with God. And all we have to do to experience that is stop. Be still. Be silent before Him. And have our minds reminded of who He is and what He's done. And I've read that of all the practices from Jesus' life, the two most important practices are solitude and community. Ironically enough, two that seem opposite from each other, but both are required. Why is this the case? Because the hurried digital distraction that we call normal is beginning to rob us of our ability to be present. And so we sit silent and still in solitude before the Lord, and in the process, we are able to be present with one another. I heard some research this week that studied college students. And it just shows the extent of our distraction in the world around us. College students, on average, switch tasks every 65 seconds, focusing on a single topic for 19 seconds at a time. And before all you older folk in the room kind of shake your head at the college students, working adults focus on a single task for an average of 3 minutes at a time before switching tasks and moving on to the next thing. What research is showing us, and the evidence it's pointing to, is that we are habitually distracted. We are constantly distracted people. And the evidence is showing us that we are missing out on the ability to be present to God, present to other people, and present to all that is good, beautiful, and true in our world. And this is where the need for solitude comes in. The ability to stop and just come. Solitude is our first practice in our way of life. And in the simple working definition of solitude is this: it is the practice of being still and quiet in the presence of God. Solitude is the practice of being still and quiet in the presence of God. Or maybe said another way, solitude is simply creating space for God. It is the practice of Psalm 46:10, be still and know that He is God. In solitude, we carve out time to be present to God, to stop from our work, and tap into the work of God in us. We let the muck and the mire and the sand of life settle to the bottom so that we can be aware of what God is doing among us. And you may ask yourself, why is this practice so important? Why is this practice from the life of Jesus so necessary? And here is the answer. Our inner lives reflect our outer lives. You see, with all the chaos and craziness that is happening around us, what we often see happen is that our inner life is a reflection of the world around us. Our world resists this practice at all costs. Stillness and silence is a challenge in our hyper-distracted, attention-deficit world. And yet, much of research is showing us that anxiety is on the rise. Loneliness is on the rise. Fear and depression are on the rise. Why? And it may just be because our world around us is actually a reflection of what is happening in us. We live in a world and live into a world that produces these things in our life. Our hearts are at a place of unrest, and therefore our lives are at a place of unrest. This is the danger of a life without solitude, a life where we are constantly on the go, constantly distracted. We struggle to connect with one another, and therefore even struggle more to connect to the heart of the Father. This is the danger. This is what we come up against. And I would say the real danger of unrest and distraction is that the noise of our modern world makes us deaf to the voice of God. I believe that we desire to hear the voice of God. We want to hear the voice of God in our lives. However, I also believe that the issue is that we have so much happening in our world around us that we may simply miss the voice of God because when he speaks, we can't hear him. Have you ever really tried to focus on someone talking to you when something else is going on? Distraction is a threat to our faith. And so often what happens is things start going off, and it happens in a way that makes it really hard for us to hear what's going on. And before you know it, things are going on. You don't hear what's happening in the background. We can't understand what's going on. And at some point, it has to just stop so that we can drown out everything and simply hear the voice of the Father. This is the danger of our modern world. We are distracted into oblivion in some ways. And as a result, we are missing out on the most important voice that matters. The very voice of God. And so we must choose to be still and know that he is God with solitude. Now, solitude is more than just a practice. I really believe that solitude is a place. Solitude is a place of space with God. As we look into this practice of solitude, this is one of the main values that we find in solitude. It is an intentionally created space to be with God. In solitude, we enjoy the very presence of the Father. In fact, I believe that this is why we see Jesus lean into the practice of solitude so often throughout his life. Take a look at a few verses from the life of Jesus with me. In Luke 5:16, Luke writes this summary catch-all phrase from the life of Jesus. And look at what he says. He says, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. In other words, Jesus often withdrew to a place of solitude. John 6:15 says this, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, he withdrew again to a mountain by himself. In the midst of the busyness, he withdraws to a place of solitude. Luke 6:12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and he spent the entire night praying to God. We see throughout the life of Jesus this regular practice where when life gets busy, when things are going well, he carves out intentional time, not in the center of the village square. He doesn't go to the ancient equivalent to a Starbucks and put some headphones in. No, he gets alone and gets away by himself to connect to the heart of the Father. In solitude, we acknowledge who God is. We honor him and adore him. We give him time. I remember when we started having kids, someone came up to me who was an empty nester. Their kids were grown adults, and he said to me, don't ever forget that a child spells love Time. A child spells love time. And I thought that is such good advice, and it's such a true reality. I could be doing nothing, but my kids enjoy simply being in my presence and doing something silly, like throwing a card into a bucket, Like, these are the things that we could occupy an entire afternoon because it's one-on-one time. I believe the same is true when it comes to our relationship with God the Father. He just wants us. He doesn't want all the stuff that we bring to him or do for him. He just wants to connect to you and to me. We don't have to come with an agenda. Our only agenda is to know him more and experience his love. That is what that place of space provides. Jesus withdrew often to be with God. We need to withdraw often to be with God in solitude. And so this act of creating space isn't just for people who don't have anything to do, but it is for everyone. It is intentionally setting aside our schedule, agenda, to-do lists, and tasks to simply adore and be alone with God. So what does this look like for you this week? Here's a practical tip that was helpful for me as I began to enter into the practice of solitude. Find a place to be with God. Simple. Find a spot anywhere that is a spot that you can go to regularly to be with God. For me, I have a brown fake leather chair from IKEA in my office at home, and every chance I get, I go to that space and I sit with my feet on the ground, because if I use the ottoman, I'm going to fall asleep in the mornings. Okay, so I sit with my feet on the ground and I simply tell God that I'm here. Here I am, Lord. You have my attention. That's the phrase that I repeat over and over to God. And I give him those 10 to 15 minutes before I open his word and pray to settle my heart and simply be with him. But that is the spot. My kids know that when dad is not in bed in the morning, where is he? He's down in the brown chair. And they come down and jump into the brown chair with me. And it's not that big of a brown chair, okay? But it's one of those things. This is it. Now, for you, it may not be an IKEA fake leather brown chair, okay? For you, it might be a park down the street. For you, it might be a reading nook in your home, or it might simply be a morning routine that begins before your kids are awake. For some of you, it might even simply be your car in the driveway before you enter back into your house from work. I don't know where it is for you. But my encouragement to you to begin to live into this practice of solitude would be to simply find a place to be with God and allow that place to be a time where you create space to lean into the presence of God in your life. As we spend time with God, we will recognize that solitude is also a place of stillness before God. In my opinion, this is probably the difficult thing about solitude. Solitude is a place of stillness before him because for me, I want to go and I want to do more. I have a very hard time sitting still. One time we had, when I was kind of between ministry roles, I had 3 weeks off. And it drove my wife absolutely nuts because I rested for about 2 days, and then I just started doing a whole bunch of stuff. And she was like, sit still, relax. Like, this is your only time you're going to have this time off. And I'm like, I'm so bored, right? Because stillness is hard for me. Even when I do sit in my chair, it's probably happening subconsciously more than I'm even aware of it, but my knee is bouncing. I'm like tapping my fingers. It is a challenge to sit still, but we must seek to give up control and every impulse to take over the situation and make it what we want it to be. That's the true gift of stillness. We surrender control and say, God, it's not about what I want this time to be about. It's about what you want it to be about. The difficulty of control is that the Israelites, when they left Egypt, they wanted to take control back. We see this in their story. The Israelites left Egypt, and in the midst of their kind of departure, Pharaoh and the Egyptians, they realized, hey, we lost all of our workers, and so they wanted to go and get them back, and so Pharaoh sends his whole army after the Israelite people. The problem is the Israelites, in their journey, they had come up to a sea, the Red Sea, and they couldn't get around it. But they had Pharaoh's armies kind of coming down on their back. They knew that their future was about to be going back to Egypt as slaves. And look at what Moses commands them to do. Look at what he tells them to do. And look at how countercultural this even feels for us to read it. Exodus 14. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see them again." And here it is. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. The Lord will fight for you. You just need to get your shield and your swords and your spears and your horses and go to battle. That's my tendency. That's what I would want to do. But Moses rightly acknowledges that in the midst of giving up our control and making something look like we want it to look like, we actually experience the deliverance and presence of God. And so solitude becomes this place where we recognize and experience that the Lord will fight for us in our stillness. That is the invitation to us today. Deliverance doesn't come from doing more for God. Deliverance comes from actually doing less, to simply be still and know that he is God. Jesus was known as a great encourager throughout his ministry. I mean, people's lives were changed, but yet there is a scene that every time I read, I am shaken by, because Jesus seems so callous towards one of his close friends. In Matthew 16, Jesus is telling the disciples about what is going to happen to him, how he will journey to Jerusalem, he will be put on trial, and how he will ultimately be convicted and crucified and killed. And Peter, one of his good friends, closest disciples, the one who Jesus looked at and actually said, "I'm going to call you Rock, the rock whom I will build my church off of." I mean, this is who Peter is. Actually gets quite a different response from Jesus in this moment. In Matthew 16, Peter, he takes Jesus aside after hearing about Jesus' upcoming death, and he says, "Never, Lord. This is not going to happen. This shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned back to him and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, and you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." I've always read this rebuke as a harsh, almost like Jesus yelling at Peter. But I was listening to a podcast this week, and the guy on the podcast suggested, what if this rebuke was more gentle? "Peter, no, get behind me. This is not my plan. This is not what God desires for the people of this world. Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me." I wonder if it was a lot more compassionate, because Peter was not being still before Jesus, but rather he was trying to take control of the situation and doing what he believed would be best for Jesus and for the disciples and for the rest of the nation of Israel. No, this is not how the story of the Messiah ends, Jesus. You're supposed to reign triumphant and bring freedom to your people. This will not happen. I won't let it happen. You see, when we don't live out of a space of solitude, the temptation for us is to be just like Peter or just like the Israelite people and take control of the situation and allow our plans to become the right plans. But rather, in stillness, we are set before God and we recognize and acknowledge that who he is and what he has said is most important. In our solitude, in our stillness before him, we surrender all control to him. We give up our control and we trust him for who he said he is, and that his promises are good for our lives. Now, I acknowledge that this is easier said than done because our minds can have a hard time shutting off. So a practical tip that I would give you to practice stillness before the Lord is what our friends at Seek Well call a dump list. Create a dump list for yourself. What you do is bring a piece of paper anytime you sit still before the Lord and a pen with you, and just any task that comes to your mind, write it down so that way you don't forget it. And then when you write it down, you come back to God and simply repeat a phrase that works for you. Here I am, Lord, your servant is listening. For me, Jesus, you have my attention. Whatever it is for you, just write it down on that dump list and allow yourself to experience stillness before the Lord. Write down the task, come back to center. Something else pops up, write down the task, come back to center. Something else pops up, 6 things pop up, your whole day pops up, write it down. Come back to center and give God a place of stillness in your life. But as you practice solitude, what you will ultimately find is that solitude becomes a place of rest in God. It becomes a place of rest in God. And I really believe that this is something that we all long for. This is something that our hearts desire more than anything, because many of us, we would describe our lives as weary and burdened. We would describe our lives as full but exhausted, and we long for rest. And the crazy thing is that God sees what we need better than we do. But we think so often that we know what's best and we know how to accomplish rest. This is exactly what the disciples wrestled with as well. Another scene in the Gospels, the disciples are sent out by Jesus to go and do ministry around the known world of the time. And they go and Jesus gives them power to do the very things that he was doing. And so they go out and they see and experience all these miracles. And they come back to Jesus. And the crowds are crowding around them, pressing in. And they're excited. They're reporting, Jesus, this blind man, he was born blind, but we prayed for him. And now he can see. Jesus, this guy, he was never able to walk, and now he can walk. Jesus, we prayed and we told the whole village about you, and they all put their faith in you. Jesus, we went to go baptize them, and they wanted to repent of their sin. Like, they're just expressing great joy over what is happening around them. And look at, again, how Jesus responds in Mark 6. Verse 30, it says, the apostles, they gathered around Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And then because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have time to eat. Been there? Felt that? What did I eat for lunch yesterday? Oh, I didn't eat lunch yesterday. I was so busy. And Jesus, seeing what they needed, simply says to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Like, again, I would imagine push harder. We got momentum on our side. People are doing things. Like, let's lean into what God the Father is doing. Yet Jesus, because he often withdrew to the quiet place to be with the heart of the Father, he knew what was ultimately needed in that place. And the crazy thing is they go away. And Jesus, he deals with the crowds. He sends them on their way. And he then goes and gets away himself. Mark 6:46 says, after leaving them, the disciples, or the crowds, he went up on a mountainside to pray. And later that night, the boat where the disciples were in was in the middle of the lake. And he, Jesus, was alone on land. See, Jesus wasn't dishing out something that he wasn't willing to take himself. He says, go get some rest. And then after a busy moment of ministry, he goes alone by himself and gets rest as well. Jesus understood that on the other end of this pace for the disciples was exhaustion, or maybe even in greater danger, the need to perform. And again, what I love about Jesus is he practiced it himself. He was taking the medicine that he was prescribing. But for you and for me, what we do is we live for the next vacation, or we are working for the weekend. In fact, in 2022, leisure travel accounted for $1.2 trillion in spending nationwide. Why? Because we long for rest. And I wonder if this longing for rest is actually a longing for the presence of God. I wonder if in solitude we would actually find the very thing our heart longs for. That we would learn to truly rest in God. That we would abide in him, which, by the way, is the same word that's used in John 15, remain in him, which is the verbal form of the word abode or home, which is a place of rest. In our resting, God reveals our actual needs for our heart, and he begins to do the deep work in us. And we start to feel the good, the bad, and the ugly, and in the midst of the many voices running through our head, we begin to hear the voice of God speak to us, and that is a place of rest. He speaks his love over us. He reminds us of our identity in him and our calling that we have been given. We receive his perspective on our life and our place in it, and he calls us back to the center of experiencing him. And when that happens, we come to a place of soul rest, to the center of peace that comes only by being in his presence. So what is a way that we can experience this kind of rest and solitude this week? A practical tip that I would give to you is unplug from distractions. I know it's hard because we always have this thing buzzing in our pockets. But for us at our house, we have a box that we put our phones in, and we are away from distractions. We put our phones away, our tablets away, or whatever else can ding or buzz or ring or remind us that we are still in a very connected world. Because ultimately what I have found for myself is that as much as I think it will, doom scrolling on social media will not give me rest. Our TV will not give me rest. Another purchase on Amazon will not give me rest. So, if those things won't give me rest, let's free ourselves from distraction so that we can experience the reality of who God is and find true rest in our soul through him. This is a picture of solitude. And friends, I want to tell you, it is for you. It is for you. So as we begin to end our time kind of introing this idea of solitude, I want to give you a word of caution, Solitude and isolation are not the same thing. A lot of times one of the pushbacks that I get is, well, being alone is not good. Those are for the extroverts, okay? Most introverts I've never heard say that. But isolation is not the same thing as solitude. While they may seem like two sides of the same coin, they could not be more different from each other. Solitude is actually engagement, whereas isolation is escape. Solitude is safety in the presence of God. Isolation is danger by being alone. Solitude is how you open yourself up to God, whereas isolation is painting a target on your back for the enemy. Solitude is when you set aside time to be fed, watered, and nourished in your soul. Isolation is what you crave when you neglect the former. Friends, in solitude, we're not alone, but rather in solitude, we feel the most connection to God. And therein lies the deepest difference between solitude and isolation. So, what is solitude? In solitude, it is a space where we create an environment for attention and connection to God. And what we will do over the coming weeks is we will pull out a story from Scripture, and we will kind of lean into that moment and see what happens in the midst of our moments of solitude, so that when they arise in us, we will be more comfortable and know how to deal with them. But I believe that one of the problems in our modern world is that we are absent from God. And so solitude is a way for us to be present with him. We are distracted and therefore disconnected, and as a result, we miss out on God's presence throughout our days. But maybe the need is to be still before him. It has been about 30 minutes, and the water is not clear quite yet. But you want to know what? it's clearer than it was. And I bet you give it another 30 minutes, and you will be able to look through it and see through the glass. You'll be able to be present before God. This is what happens. Start small. Work your way into a place of solitude. But don't view coming to church once a week as your ability to kind of get your God hit for the week. That will not be enough for you. It won't be enough. In solitude, we create an environment where we are attentive to God and lean in to connect with him. So the way I see it, we have two options before us. Option A is that we just ignore this practice. We ignore it and we make excuses. We get sucked back into the rat race and face emotional unhealth at best and a spiritual desert at worst. Or option B is that we recapture this ancient practice from the life of Jesus in solitude and we experience the presence, the plan, and the peace of God in our life. So again, my advice to you is start small this week. Maybe start with 5 minutes. Maybe start with 10 minutes if you've done it before. If you have young kids at home, there's much grace. I get that. Just look for a few moments throughout the day. And try to add in, over time, longer stints. Maybe as a part of your Sabbath or a periodic retreat. Solitude is more about resting than working. Solitude is more about not doing than doing. Remember, subtraction, not addition. Solitude will help you experience a yoke that is easy and light. And my desire is that we would experience that together as we invite the presence of God, not only into this space, but into our lives each and every day.